Welcome, everyone. My name is Ann Albert, and I am the Klatt Family Director for Public Programs here at the Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our second program in a series called Canon in Context, in which we're taking a historical approach to thinking about works that have come to be seen as settled Jewish law. So the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Mishneh Torah, and the Shulchan Aruch will all be getting the treatment, so to speak, as we ask about the circumstances of their creation, who wrote them or compiled them, and how, where, why, what were their aims, and what did it mean to the people who put these works together. The topic as a whole is, of course, deeply connected to the work that the research fellows here in our building in Philadelphia are doing throughout the course of this academic year. These fellows are here from all over the world, studying various aspects of Jewish law before modernity. So they're looking at law in theory and practice, focusing on the broad context in which Jewish law was developed as a necessary component for understanding the dynamics of Jewish culture, history, governance, economics, and much more. If you would like to learn more about the topic and the fellows who are here, you can always visit our website. Now, if you weren't with us last week for the first program in this particular series featuring Mira Balberg talking about the Mishnah, it was great. And I do invite you to check it out on YouTube. There should be a link to the Katz Center's YouTube channel in the chat shortly, if there isn't now. And there on our YouTube channel, you'll find many of our past programs, and that is also where today's talk will be posted in a few days, in case you want to watch it again or share it. Also in the chat, you will find a link to information about the Friends of the Katz Center, which is a wonderful group of donors who have come together to support our programming, especially these talks that are available and accessible to all. If you're interested in contributing and joining that community, do check it out, and we look forward to connecting with you. As always, we're also very grateful to the Klatt family and the Harry Stern Family Foundation for their generous support. Finally, I want to make sure that I acknowledge some important contributors to our public programs, my colleagues here at the Katz Center. So Diana Dennis Walters, who's here on the line with us, putting things in the chat, takes care of all the logistics to get our speakers present and connected to you. Brian Lipscomb is our tech genius who's usually with us, making sure everything is working properly, although we don't blame him when it doesn't. And Dr. Becky Friedman takes care of communications, making sure you get to find out about the talks. She gets credit for the beautiful images on our website and social media. And just to call out that when Mira Balberg last week noted that somebody had made up the brilliant title of her talk, Decoding the Mishnah. Credit for that goes to Becky Friedman. One last thing, in case you're new here, I'll just say how we'll proceed. Our speaker, as usual, will give a talk for about 40 minutes, and afterwards I'll moderate Q&A so that your comments and questions can get to the speaker. Please feel free to submit a question using the Q&A function, which should be at the bottom of your Zoom screen anytime during the hour. And at the end, I'll probably need to compile some. We have about 200 people joining us right now. So I'm delighted that you're all able to be here. All right, without taking any more time away from the content of our hour, I will introduce our speaker. Simcha Gross is Assistant Professor of Ancient Rabbinics at the University of Pennsylvania. He's a specialist in ancient and early medieval Jewish history with a particular focus on the contextual study of the rabbis and rabbinic literature in their Persian and Islamic contexts. He also specializes in the study of Syriac Christianity. He's well published. He's the author of one book called The History of the, quote, Slave of Christ, From Jewish Child to Christian Martyr. This is a translation and introduction to a Syriac martyr act that features a Jewish convert, really fascinating text. And he's also the editor of a volume on Jews and Syriac Christians in the first millennium. He has also a hopefully soon to be published book that lays out a new account of Babylonian Judaism under Sasanian rule, and I have it on good account that it's absolutely brilliant. So today he is talking, of course, as you know, about the social and cultural worlds of the rabbis of the Talmud and how they emerged as the dominant stream of Jewish practice and tradition. So Simcha, I welcome you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Diana. Thank you to the Cat Center for inviting me to participate in this wonderful series, of course, about the Jewish legal canon, where the Talmud would, it would seem, be a perfect and obvious fit. It certainly is the way the Talmud is perceived to the present as a legal text, part of the Jewish legal canon, essential to the Jewish legal canon. And what I want to do today is, to some extent, problematize this based on where scholarship is on two major questions. Number one, who were the rabbis? And number two, what is the Talmud? So one's a social historical question, one's a literary historical question, but we'll see that they're deeply intertwined. And just to forecast where we're going, I'll begin with a brief overview, timeline, situate us chronologically, geographically. Then I'll kind of represent common assumptions about the rabbis and the Talmud, and then I'll give some overview about where scholarship is on those questions, how they got to those different opinions, and conclude by somewhat provocatively thinking about the Talmud in the Jewish legal canon. So first, the timeline. Just to quickly situate us in the kind of very basic heuristic timeline of ancient Jewish history. We have our first temple period, David, Solomon, and so on. This period ends in 586 BCE due to the destruction of the kingdom of Judah by the Babylonians. There were two kingdoms. At some point, the kingdom of the north was already destroyed. This is now the kingdom of the south that's destroyed. We have a period traditionally known as the period of restoration under Persian rule, Achaemenid Persian rule. This is replaced by Hellenistic rule, Alexander the Great in 333, and then so on after him. We have the Hasmonean revolt, Jewish semi-autonomy for much of this period, Roman rule, Pompey and others. And finally, we get to the Judean revolt, known as the Great Revolt. It might not have been such a great idea, but we have the Great Revolt for around 4 years, 8 years, and then eventually the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And that's really where the story of the rabbis begins in all accounts. And the common assumptions about the rabbis pick up here and basically say, who were the rabbis? Well, they were the natural successors of the Second Temple Jewish movements. Typically, they are associated with the Pharisees. We don't need to go into details. And so following the destruction of the temple, we kind of have a natural transition from priests and scribes in the late Second Temple period to rabbis who inherit the mantle of leadership, of rule over Jews across the world. This leads to point two. The rabbis are immediately widely recognized and authoritative, just as their predecessors were, so too now they fill their seat. And within the land of Israel and of course around the world, they are immediately recognized as authoritative and dispense law everywhere, such that rabbinic Judaism equals Judaism, or Judaism equals rabbinic Judaism. And to sustain such an influential movement across the world, you'd have to be rather large, robust, and significant. And that's what we commonly think the rabbis must have been at the outset of the movement. Lastly, for our purposes, since we're talking about the Babylonian Talmud, around the 3rd century, we have a satellite movement develop, leaving the Galilee, the land of Israel, and establishing itself in central Iraq under the Sasanian Empire. And at this point, we now have two very robust movements, one in Palestine, one in Sasanian Iraq, which influenced the world at large. Within Babylonia, and this is, I think, the last of our overview, we have three periods of rabbinic periods. The first is the Amoraic period of the Amoraim, the Sayers. These are the rabbis who appear in the Talmud. They're roughly from the 3rd to the early 6th century. We have a very opaque period often known as the Savaraic period of the Savaraim, the interpreters, the reasoners. And then we have the Geonim. These are the heads of academies, first in different cities and then eventually in Baghdad from roughly the 7th through the 11th century. So the Babylonian rabbis, just like for the rabbis immediately after the Second Temple period, our assumptions about the rabbis in Babylonia are similar. Number one, widely recognized and authoritative from day one. They have formal positions of authority. They have power to enforce their legal decisions. Everyone recognizes them. Secondly, and this is what the image on the side here evokes, they're a central institutionalized movement. They're located in academies, large academies, many students, and there are all sorts of knock-on effects of imagining this as an academic setting. Not only huge followings, but we have appointed heads of the academy. They then have successors. It's easy if you want to have a rabbinic opinion, you just go to the academy. Everyone knows where to go. The academy can therefore dispense and promulgate legal decisions across the world. It's all very centralized, easily recognizable, hierarchical, and clear. That's what we typically assume about the Babylonian rabbis. What then do we typically assume about the Babylonian Talmud? Well, naturally, if the movement is centralized, the teachings of this movement are easily recorded. So if we're in the academy, the way we should imagine the Talmud's formation is what you see here as bullet point number 2 as a transcript or stenographer theory. Essentially, rabbis, academy heads are sitting in their academy, they're dispensing opinions, their students ask them questions. The most prominent students are the ones who we know about. And this conversation is being recorded in real time almost over generations, that is incrementally. So each generation, each academy head has conversations with his students in this large academic setting where your stenographer is more or less copying orally, of course, but copying, memorializing this conversation for all time. And then it accretes layers each generation until we close it at the end. Therefore, the Talmud as we have it is almost entirely contemporaneous with the lives of the rabbis who appear in the Talmud, right? So if we're talking about a 4th century rabbi and we have the 4th century conversation, that's because this all took place in the 4th century, was written down in the 4th century, and therefore everything in the Talmud dates roughly to the period of the rabbis in it. The Talmud is therefore closed with basically the last named prominent rabbis in the Talmud. Typically, this is associated with 2 rabbis, Ravina and Ravashi, that doesn't matter. And this is in the late 5th, early 6th century, we close it. Maybe there's some touching up here and there, but the text itself is mostly solidified at this point. It therefore becomes an immediately influential law code. After all, the rabbis are authoritative and centralized. So if they're dispensing opinions before they have a text, well, now they have a text, very easy to dispense with this text across the world. And so we should imagine right after this period, right after the period of the Amoraim, or the rabbis who appear in the Talmud, we now have an authoritative text, orally, eventually written, dispensed across the world, in which people imbue with authority immediately. These 2 questions are fundamentally being challenged by scholars over the past 40 or so years, and increasingly so. And what scholars have largely begun to realize is that the common assumptions, as I've called them, emerge or were birthed in the medieval rabbinic academies between the 9th and the 11th centuries. They are particularly traceable to a number of medieval rabbinic chronographies, that is, these kinds of histories of the rabbinic movement from the past until their own day. On the bottom here, you see the 2 most influential of these, the Order of the Tanaim V'Amoraim, or the Seder Tanaim V'Amoraim, less influential, and then the Epistle or Igeret of Shira Gaon, which was hugely influential over the course of history in framing the way we understand the rabbinic past. What scholars have come to accept is that, for the most part, these accounts do not simply reflect reality of the Talmudic past, but instead retroject anachronistically their own medieval realities onto the rabbinic past. And they do this for a number of reasons. Partly it's because it's a claim of authority. It situates their own rabbis, who are the ones writing these texts, in a chain of succession of academy heads from the first rabbis in Babylonia until their own day. We have a clear line of transmission of knowledge. It goes from the first rabbi through to the current academy head, and it offers a neatly packaged story of what the Talmud is. The Talmud is simply the sayings of my predecessors, I say, as Sri Gaon in 987 CE. And scholars therefore now ask, well, what if we were to re-examine the Talmudic past, both who were the rabbis and what is the Talmud, outside of the questions of the common, outside of the common assumptions, that is, outside of these medieval academies and their effect on our retelling of the past. I should note, parenthetically, this is a very common move over the last 50 years in fields across the academy. In particular, early Islam has gone through a similar scholarly transition where the Quranic past has been thoroughly questioned, given that it was mostly predicated on sources from the 9th through 11th century, a period in which there's much imagination about the past, but perhaps not as much accurate retelling of that past. So let's return to our two questions. Question number one, who were the rabbis who appear in the Talmud? And what scholars have essentially done is we've transitioned from a model of academies to a model of disciple circles. And I want to start, before I explain what disciple circles are, to note this is not a transition from sophisticated to not sophisticated, from advanced to primitive, even though I hate to admit in scholarship it's often framed that way. But these are just entirely different kinds of social backgrounds. I specifically chose the picture of Socrates because, as we'll see, this is how we think most philosophical movements in antiquity worked. They were mostly small and around a master, but I'm getting ahead of myself. We can see this here, defining what a disciple circle is. These are the features of a disciple circle. How did a disciple circle function? Number one, they're based primarily around a single charismatic master. So in the case of the picture, of course, we have Socrates, but in general, we should imagine this as a single figure who, for whatever reason, attracts students, and the students are particularly interested in studying with that teacher. The study is therefore very intimate and direct. This is why when you're reading the Talmud, you'll have a student say to a rabbi, what's with that tree? How do I assess it? Why did you say this to that person? How much should I pay for this thing? Also, what are your bedroom practices? What are your restroom practices? These kind of questions emerge because we should imagine a much more intimate and direct setting rather than a more distant, detached academic setting. Number two, as a result of, or number three here, as a result of this, there are a few clear notions of hierarchy or succession. These aren't academies. These are entirely predicated around the master. And therefore, when the master dies, the study circle dies. The disciple circle disappears. It dissipates naturally with the death of a master. This also means that we shouldn't think of these as having corporate identities. They don't exist as for all time as that circle in that place. These are constantly changing, constantly in flux, and we'll see a few stories in a moment which narrate the flux within these movements. And lastly, and arguably most importantly for us, this therefore means that the rabbinic movement is not centralized. It's rather local. It's decentralized. It's messy. Rabbis don't necessarily enjoy widespread authority. They aren't necessarily widely recognized. They don't necessarily have huge followers overnight. This is a process that transpires over the course of antiquity through the Middle Ages. And I should note, even though we're talking about Babylonia, the same holds for the Palestinian rabbis. In some ways, the paradigms for both Palestine and Babylonia have over time fed each other in the scholarship. I just wanted to read again to get back to this point that this isn't to say that these are unsophisticated or primitive. These were in some ways better vehicles for creating very strong attachments in identity between the student and the master, to allow the student to engage fully with the master in all aspects of life and all aspects of their teaching and instruction. These are two great scholars of antiquity and specifically scholasticism in education and antiquity. And I'll just read the second one because it's, I think, poignant. Since a school was a teacher, logical corollaries were the impermanence of the institution and the vulnerability of students to lack of stability and to change. And that's exactly what we imagine when we think of disciple circles. If you look at the first quote, right, they don't survive after the death of a master. It's entirely predicated around the rabbinic master himself. We don't need to read these stories inside. I'll just describe them, and these are really just the tip of the iceberg. We have collections of these sources. I'm looking at the books that collect them. To give you some examples of some of the features of disciple circles that we now see in the Babylonian Talmud. Number one, informal gatherings. We used to interpret any word that implied a head, the head of a circle, or the head of a rabbinic head, as if that meant an academy head. What we've realized is that just means that they're heading a disciple circle. And if you look at source one, we see this in arguably the most acute way, because you have four rabbis sitting together, and they basically realize we need to appoint a head. That is the very way in which you would think about studying as rabbis in the late antique period in Babylonia is always to have somebody who you appoint as your head, and then the students, because that's just how pedagogy worked. That's how the structure worked. And so these four rabbis, notice it's a small group of rabbis, these four rabbis sit and they say, let's appoint one of us over the rest of us as head. This is not, as it has been read historically, the appointment of the head of an academy. This is the ad hoc appointment of a single rabbi to rule over a group of rabbis in this particular study session. In other cases, we have it clear, it's more clear that it's the establishment of a disciple circle, but in this case, it's pretty clear that this term head doesn't mean head of academy, it means heads of these kinds of informal gatherings. The second source, direct study with a master. Here we have a rabbi approach the great Abaye and say to him essentially, hey, can you teach me? Can I join your study circle? Can I be your disciple? And he says, no, I can't. I don't have time for you. I'm too busy working the fields. I have a lot of responsibility. I don't have time for this. And the student says, well, what if I were to do your manual labor on your behalf? And the rabbi says, that's great. Good. This is a good deal for me. And now we can have this kind of intimate relationship. Needless to say, this isn't tuition to an academy. This isn't a formal setting. This is very much this kind of intimate interaction between a student and the master. And lastly, we actually have many stories, surprising number of stories, of the disbanding of study circles upon the death of a master. We have one here below. The frame is always the same. When so-and-so died, his students up and went. And what's fascinating about them is they almost always thematize the following point: the conflict between the former master students and their new master. So as they're going to a circle, they come to a new circle and the master is teaching something and they say, you're teaching it all wrong. Our old master taught it better. Or why are you talking about medical prescriptions? That's not a lofty enough matter to participate in a study circle. Our old master would never have wasted our time discussing this. So again, very much the temporary nature of these study circles is apparent in these group of stories. Okay, so that's the question, who were the rabbis? We've transitioned from academies to disciple circles. What about the Talmud? And here what we've done is we've moved from the transcript or stenography theory to an entirely new theory, which is a theory of late editors or redactors. So what scholars have realized is that actually, if you look at the Talmud, and I have prepared a slide, we'll see it in a moment, where we can color code this and visualize this, most of the Talmud that we have is in fact anonymous editorial material. If you think about this as any anthology, the Talmud is a series of statements, a series of teachings, a series of stories, and those are framed by anonymous material. What is this anonymous material? Well, we used to explain this as the stenographer or the question of a student, but we no longer think this. What we have begun to notice, and this is bullet point 2 under number 1, we realize that there's actually, it seems, a time lapse between the editorial material and the earlier sayings. That is, these anonymous comments are reframing the earlier material, sometimes misunderstanding, sometimes amending or reshaping, putting them in a new context where they clearly don't fit. And we know they don't fit because we often have them in the other contexts where they fit much better. And lastly, this layer has its own ideas that it sometimes tells us very forthrightly without attributing it to an earlier master, but which has no parallel in any statement of any earlier master. This suggests to scholars that this layer actually appears to have been composed after the rabbis who appear in the Talmud and who lived during the late antique period, and was composed therefore at a later date. Other features about this genre that tipped off scholars that it's its own layer and its own period is it uses highly editorial formulaic language. That is, it's not as if this isn't organic conversation. These are clearly cues meant to mark set types of questions and answers. We'll see this in a moment. I've marked these off. Come in here. Is this really the case? What's your proof text? These kinds of formulaic sayings that frame the earlier material. And so again, we've now moved from the Talmudic period, that is the compilation of the Talmud happened during the period when the rabbis in the Talmud lived, to thinking that it's actually a post-Talmudic creation. The editorial material postdates the rabbis. It creates an editorial framework in which it's situating a ton of fascinating material that it has received. It also amends it, it plays with it, it might even invent some of it. And this is where we get to the kind of more radical places where this theory can take us. But it also therefore signals an entirely different period of the rabbinic movement. This is the final point on the slide here. What scholars now do, one might say, is actually akin to a kind of textual archaeology. We have our earlier sayings and we have our editorial material. And part of what we're doing is both piecing these layers apart and then also trying to tell a story about what might have happened between the earlier material and this later material, which might understand it differently, which might reflect or presuppose a different social, historical, legal, cultural context. So again, it's now textual archaeology rather than stenography. This is just simply what happened in the discussion exactly on the date when Rabbi so-and-so said such and such. Here is an example of our blank slate, our page of Talmud. Don't worry, we will not read this. For those who are interested, this is I'm working on a piece about this as we speak, but it's essentially about elite figure known as the Exilarch in Babylonia, and what kind of authority did he have? Okay, and this story has typically this source, this legal discussion, lengthy legal discussion. If you notice, we have A through H is my division, but around 8 different pieces to this discussion. It's a lengthy discussion. And we would typically have read this as a kind of organic conversation that happened over time, accreting layers as each rabbi said what they said. This is how scholars now would read this source. And I should note that I'm colorblind, so I've really made my task difficult for myself today. But more or less, we have here a number of discrete parts. We have attributions. The rabbis taught, Rav Nachman taught, so-and-so taught, right? That is, we're attributing a statement to a particular rabbi. Needless to say, the rabbi himself didn't say this. This might be early, this might be late, but this is just an attribution. We then have the saying itself. I've here marked off in different colors. I know that the Amaraic saying is in red. A early rabbinic saying, the Tannaitic saying or early rabbinic saying, and a later saying of a rabbi of our period in red. We then have stories about rabbis. These are not simply dicta or instructions. These are just narrations about them. What exactly these might be, when they might date to, is subject to some debate. And then we have our yellow, our anonymous editorial material, which you can see is roughly most of this lengthy source. And I've also underlined those parts that kind of are the formulaic pieces. You can even see, come in here, they raised a question, hear from this, but behold, come in here, right? Even in this one source, these formulaic sayings repeat themselves and structure our entire conversation. These formulaic sayings are what allow us to get from A to H. They're what unify the entire conversation, what make this into a discussion, what allow scholars and practitioners to call this a sugya, that is to treat this as a single entity. The only reason we can do that is because someone came after the fact and created all of it and pieced it together. And that would be our editor. So, but before I go there, we've now transitioned from academies to disciples and from the stenographer theory to this redaction theory, this post-Amoraic, post-Talmudic redaction. We don't have enough time to dwell for too long on what this monumental change in perspective has done to our understanding of the Babylonian rabbis, this text, and the movement. But I will note that scholars almost exclusively, this is one of the primary preoccupations of scholars today, is to try to assess what has changed, what seems to have changed between the Amoraic past, that is the Talmudic period, and the editorial material that frames it. And some of what we see, back to our questions of who were the rabbis, is we actually seem to see a changing social and institutional context. We now seem to have what appear to be references to academy heads and what appear to be stories about academies with many students in very formal seating arrangements in a large gathering and setting with much detachment and distance between the master and the disciples. There's also indication that we have a bit of a more popular movement now. That is, the rabbis seem to be recognized a bit more broadly, and they have encounters with the public more often than they did in the earlier stories. This also, it has been suggested, this changing institutional setting from disciple circles to some kind of institutional setting may also explain why the editorial layer looks the way that it does. Why is it anonymous, this editorial layer? That is, why do rabbis ever stop engaging in the way rabbis always engage? I have an opinion, no, you have an opinion, no, I have an opinion. Why is it now anonymous? And perhaps it's because we now have a massive collective setting, an academy, in which it's no longer fitting or easy to have a discussion where a master says something and students think about it. Instead, what we now have is a collective endeavor to take material from these earlier rabbis in this more intimate setting and make sense of it, understand it, analyze it. And therefore, we're going to frame it anonymously because we don't have new opinions to add necessarily. We're going to interact with the past by reformulating, rethinking the past. This is therefore a project of synthesis. This is point number 2 on the bottom here. We're not creating new statements, we're synthesizing the knowledge that we have, though I don't want to make that too hard and fast of a distinction because the anonymous layer is incredibly innovative. It's just innovative in a distinct way. And this is therefore why we see a kind of dialectical study of earlier teaching. All these questions and answers. This isn't necessarily how rabbis engaged one another in antiquity. It could very well be that it was, how do you interpret that earlier source? What do you think about this legal ruling here? What would you rule in this setting? And it's the anonymous layer that really begins to have this synthesizing project of dialectical reflection, questions and answers over and over again until you've mined every aspect of every saying. I wish I could go into more detail here. I want to respect everyone's time and have time for Q&A, but just to give you an example of one of these, arguably the most famous and most published on story, it's a much longer story. I've only taken a section of it, but for a variety of reasons, here's a story which scholars believe actually dates entirely for the most part, to the post-Talmudic period. And it imagines the rabbinic past, much as the medieval chronographies, which we'll get back to in a moment, imagine the rabbinic past as academies. A rabbi sits in a row. There's 7 rows. They sit on cushions, depending on how high their rank is in this academic setting. And as scholars have noted, this academy is very much imagined and perhaps really looked like the Sasanian royal court. As you see here on the right side, we've these 3 Sasanian silver plates. The royal court in the Sasanian Empire typically distinguished people by cushions. How many cushions you sat in was a sign of your prestige. And if you see 7 cushions, almost all of these silver plates have 6 or 7 cushions. So that really was, it seems, the kind of number of wholeness that showed how elevated a person was. If you look at the bottom here, this is a admittedly later source describing how the Sasanian kings sat. And it says, and there are other sources that corroborate this, that the way the king sat and with their court and the courtiers was that they arranged them in rows according to rank. And this is exactly what the story in the Talmud describes and what the medieval academies, it sounds like, also, the form they also took. So we do seem to have some transition here of from disciple circles to academies, and those academies look rather Persianized, which is an interesting sub-detail to this whole discussion. Unfortunately, apart from the anonymous layer, really this period, that is the post-Talmudic period, is what has often been called the Babylonian Jewish Dark Ages, roughly the 6th through the 8th centuries. And here, almost our entire history of this period, prior to this discovery of the anonymous layer that frames the entire Talmud, was these medieval chronographies. And so all we did was essentially reproduce what the medieval chronographies told us happened during the Dark Ages. I should note, they themselves often say, we actually don't have a lot of details about this period. It's a kind of enduring question, what happened in this period of transition? And our primary source for it is, in fact, this anonymous layer. So mining it for information of this sort, of social, cultural, legal changes, is crucial to understanding the history of this period. To plug something that I wrote with my colleague Avigail Manneken-Bamberger, which should come out soon, I can discuss this in the Q&A. There is one other set of evidence for this period known as the Jewish Babylonian incantation bulls. We have about 240 of these in the Penn Museum, but there are thousands of these around the world. These seem to date roughly to the same period, and we contend that they actually might also help us at least complement the evidence that we have in the anonymous layer, and I'm happy to expand on this, but broadly speaking, they seem to also suggest that rabbis are recognized by certain groups of people who are becoming more socialized in rabbinic teachings, instructions, and law, perhaps indicating that rabbinic influence is spreading during this period beyond where it was during the Talmudic past. We'll get to these if we have time. So back to our medieval academies and the birth of the common assumptions. Part of what happened when these medieval chronographies looked back in time and retrojected their own settings was that they painted the past in their own guise. They made them into academies, right? No longer disciple circles. These are academic settings, just like the ones we find in the medieval period. And they made the Talmud usable to service their legal ends, to spread rabbinic instruction across the world. When they did this, however, they encountered a bit of a problem, which is that the Talmud, because of its process of creation from the Amoraic period, where rabbis are simply studying with their masters, to the anonymous layer, which is not interested in law, it's not interested in solving legal disputes and giving us a final legal opinion. It's interested in the dialectic. It's interested in the question and answer. The Talmud is not useful as a law code. And alongside the chronographies, as rabbinic, the Gaonim, this medieval rabbinic academies are spreading their authority, sending letters, epistles across the world, we have the spread of a new genre of work. And this is a genre of work of basically restatements of the Talmud. They abridge the Talmud, or they paraphrase the Talmud, or they take out only the legal bits that they consider to be the final rulings that one should abide by and follow. In other words, what these works do, even though they are not the Talmud, they essentially teach us, instruct us to think of the Talmud as fundamentally a legal text that you should use to derive law from. They're no longer collections of stories of these disciple circles. They're no longer about this ongoing synthesizing project, this dialectical project, questioning and answering, thinking about, delving into these rabbinic instructions, these texts. Instead, it's about determining final law. And they, in some ways, even as they're saying that the Talmud is final law, they're also essentially admitting it's not useful for final law. It's rather complicated to use. It's almost impossible to use to really derive any kind of clear sense of law, of how one should practice. So in other words, the story of the Talmud becoming part of the legal canon is really a story in some ways of remembering certain things about the Talmud. It has law in it, and forgetting so much about the rabbinic past. We forget the disciple circles. We forget how unsystematized this past was, how personal, how intimate it was. We forget about these editors who are engaging with this past in an entirely different way. Questions and answers, they're not interested in final law. That doesn't seem to be the purpose of the editorial project. And we instead reconceive of the Talmud as a legal code, one that we should all in some ways study. We now have the Daf Yomi cycle, which people study, and I think dwell particularly on the legal aspects of the text because we've been trained to think of it as a legal code. And the last thing I would say is I actually think the Talmud is therefore a useful metaphor in some ways for how law works in general. Law always, in some ways, emerges precisely from these contingent and messy contexts. And over time, the legal systems that we create allow us to forget how messy that past was, how disputed, how complicated, and instead creates this picture as if the law always was this one thing. The codes we have are always the law that we should follow. And hopefully, we can spend some time also understanding how that past is rich. It's the messy and the contingent is in some ways the most fascinating, the most enjoyable to study. And also that might tell us a bit about what law was in this period and understand how law became what it is today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simcha. We have a ton of questions, super engaged audience, and also really smart questions. So I just want to shout out to everybody who's here. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry that we probably won't get to all of them. I want to actually start by going back to the disciple circles context, because we have a bunch of questions about sort of how that worked and what that looked like. Among them are what degree of literacy was typical in that time and place, and so how many people could conceivably have operated as rabbis in these circles. Also, was literacy required, or was this totally oral? How did somebody become one of these rabbis or disciples? Who were they? Where did they come from? What from within the social world, and how did they relate to the rest of the world? And connected with that is a question about their charisma. So if a master was chosen not only for his smarts and his knowledge, but for having some kind of leadership capability, what did that look like? Can you kind of speak to that context?
These questioners are stealing my book project, so don't get any ideas. These are fantastic questions. In terms of literacy, that's relatively an easy one. No literacy required. We think that this movement was entirely oral, and the wild part is that we think it was entirely oral well into the 9th and 10th century, even as the Talmud is beginning to circulate in written form in Spain, in North Africa. We begin to have evidence that they're working with material texts. We think that the academies in Babylonia are maintaining their oral setting throughout. I think we can pick at this a little bit, specifically for the medieval period. For the late antique period, there's no reason whatsoever to think that they are writing. Yaakov Zussman, a great Israeli scholar, has a very influential article that basically makes the case that the rabbis are always oral. Just in terms of the question of literacy, there's a book by Catherine Hesher about Jewish literacy and antiquity. But for Babylonia, we have discussions where rabbis are saying things like, what if you can't sign your own name? And the question is whether you can make a mark, whether someone can sign for you. So when literacy even occurs, it doesn't occur as something particularly important to the movement as such, but it just as a legal problem you have to solve. Where did they come from? Yeah, this is a really important question that I have. I have a related question, which is, to what extent, this is another, I shouldn't be saying these things, it's another paper I'm working on as we speak, to what extent were these rabbinic movements geographically, or these disciple circles, geographically confined? We still think that Rabbi so-and-so taught in city such and such. I'm not convinced that they were so localized. I think they were probably pretty itinerant. This would explain why we have tons of stories where somebody comes looking for a rabbi in one city and they say, no, he's in that city right now. Well, why is he in that city? Why are these rabbis never to be found where people expect them to be found? I just think that they're itinerant. They're probably wandering around. And this gets to our third question about charisma. I think we probably need to think of this movement as a movement built primarily around charisma during this period. And therefore, necessarily, if you want followers, you need to go around and encounter followers, right? You need to try to galvanize people to join your movement. And I actually wonder, to return to the other question, if localized rabbis, those who do appear to be more local, are actually the more successful and more charismatic rabbis, or more successfully charismatic rabbis. That is, maybe it's a luxury. I have enough students now who can do my agricultural work, or who can, pay me a little bit. We actually don't know what the arrangements would have been like, or they're independently wealthy. But perhaps the more successful rabbis were those who were able to stay more local, and the other rabbis were those who are more itinerant. I should note there are stories that explicitly talk about itinerant rabbis. It's clear there are rabbis that are relocating all the time, including these study circles that disband upon the death of a master. But I think that actually we just need to reconsider entirely how this early disciple circle movement is functioning. So these are fantastic questions. Thank you.
Get ready, because there's a lot more. So this is another set of questions that relates to that same context. Several people are asking about the relation between the disciple circles, or that as a mode or a setting, and early Christianity. So somebody asks, can you comment whether there are current scholarly theories on parallels with circles that produced canonical and non-canonical gospels? So there's that question. And then I'll pair with that one that you may not be able to answer because it's not your field. And so I'm throwing it in just in case you want to, which is several people are imagining this is really similar to early Hasidism. And if you want to speak to whether that's a parallel or if there are differences you can identify.
So remind me the first part.
Early Christianity.
Oh, Christianity, yeah. First, to plug a book, there's a book by a guy named Daniel Kaner, which is really, there are many works like this, but it's a particularly useful one called Wandering and Begging Monks. And part of the argument there is a very similar one to that field has undergone a similar transition, which is after the monastic movement was institutionalized, they retrojected that institutionalization onto the past. I have some of these books up here, which discuss precisely this problem. When in fact, if you actually read the sources, it's apparent that we have, not only do we have wandering figures, these holy men who are wandering around, teachers of all sorts who are wandering around, but that as this movement becomes more institutionalized, they're increasingly considered a problem. What do we do about the fact that we still have all these wandering saints all around here? We need to get rid of them. We need to institutionalize. So it's very similar, I think, to what what holy men looked like in late antiquity. And holy men, I mean, as a totally generic category that encompasses philosophers, instructors, and saints, miracle workers, and so on. For the most part, when they weren't institutionalized, they had to have a kind of more informal setting in which they gained followers over time. So I think it's very similar to what's happening in early Christianity, but also Manichaeism, which is another movement that's emerging at this time, and philosophical circles, which still exist until roughly the 5th century, 6th century, I should say, first half of the 6th century. I don't want to comment on the Hasidism question because it's not my expertise, but what I would say is, again, that hardly surprises me because I don't think, and this is fairly typical of, unfortunately, a poor way in which scholars often think about the past. When I say that it's like Christians, I don't mean that they're looking at Christians and saying, we want to do what the Christians are doing. When I say they're like Christians, what I mean is simply, this is what uninstitutional settings often look like and how this transition often occurs. It would not surprise me at all if the same thing happens in the 15th century or in the 21st century. That is, this is something that can happen anytime, anywhere. It just happens to be particularly richly attested for the late antique period that I study.
Fantastic. Okay, this is a different kind of question, but I think a lot of people might be interested in hearing the answer. Davida asks, how do current scholars view the stories about Hillel and Shammai? So the selection of Hillel as head, the stories about interactions between their followers, preferences, that sort of thing. Like, how do you fit that into the framework that you've set up?
So I'll answer this more abstractly to not just be about Hillel and Shammai. what scholars do is one of two things. They'll either say these are retrojections of and creations of the later anonymous layer, which, as I said, it's not just a framing project, though it's also that. It also can innovate and write full stories. This is most closely identified with the work of Jeffrey Rubenstein from NYU, who's written 3 books on the subject. But it's quite clear that they have the luxury of writing these stories in which they retroject or at least presuppose their own historical context. And so often what scholars will argue is that's what's happening in these stories. Alternatively, institutions aren't so difficult to imagine. This is something that I disagree with some of my colleagues on. Just because somebody presupposes or imagines an institution of some sort, some kind of institutional setting, doesn't necessarily mean it's late. But there's a preponderance of evidence that suggests that's not what the movement actually looked like. Not just internal material, but also external. And so you either can deal with it by saying it's a later retrojection, or you say, okay, fine, they imagine institutions sometimes. It's not as if when you look back in the ancient Jewish past, they don't have the Sanhedrin, these kind of, and they often imagine the academies as a Sanhedrin or this kind of a Senate, Jewish Senate. They have plenty of paradigms to work with for that. And so why not think about these kind of mythical figures of Hillel and Shammai as, which they do, as figures in this Senate of Jewish leaders, very formalized.
Okay, here's another one. A few people are also asking about the Jerusalem Talmud. So how does the progression that you've described result in the establishment of 2 separate works or bodies?
This is a great question. It's a lot, but it's great. Part of the way in which scholars began to realize that the Babylonian Talmud was distinct is as they became more literarily sensitive to these texts, they looked at the Palestinian Talmud and said, this doesn't have any of the editorial layer and sophistication that we find in the Babylonian Talmud. It's just almost entirely absent. There are actually some good scholarship now that's showing that it's not entirely absent, but for the most part, it just doesn't have any of the kind of anonymous apparatus that's framing the entire text. This is partly why scholars said something different's happening with the Babylonian Talmud, and that something is chronology. There's a time lapse. We have more time in which this material is being processed and thought over. There are also theories about how the Palestinian Talmud was hurriedly closed. It was closed, or people stopped developing it at a very early stage, and that's why it kind of reads far more poorly. It's far more difficult to make sense of it because it never underwent this lengthy period of redaction. That's on the literary level. On the social level, there are all sorts of questions. There's also a kind of Palestinian rabbinic dark age. What happens after this, the Palestinian Talmud closes in the 4th century or so? It's not entirely clear, but one of my interests, this is the hopefully at one point forthcoming book, is it's not entirely clear to me to what extent the Roman context, and I mean the Roman imperial context, creates a different social reality than the Sasanian context. Typically, the way we've thought about this is that the Sasanian Empire actually is the one that's authorizing the Babylonian rabbis. I don't think that's true at all. That's basically the thesis of my book. I don't think the Sasanian Empire particularly cares what Jews are doing. Whereas the Roman Empire actually does have laws on the book that gives some power to Jewish clerical figures, who they are somewhat subject to debate, and empower, it seems, potentially local clerical types, maybe. So one could argue that at some point in late antiquity, there actually might be more evidence to entirely reverse the paradigm and suggest that instead of Babylonia being more rabbinic, rabbis being more powerful in Babylonia, in fact, we might reverse it, or we might just say that they're not particularly powerful in either place until roughly the 5th and 6th century, when we begin to see in both places some kind of a transition. So that's on the literary and then the social level.
That's really helpful. Okay, I do want to make sure that I have a chance to ask you to talk a little bit more about the Dark Ages and about some of the sources that we have from that time. It was tantalizing what you referred to just briefly in your talk. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
I'll share my screen really quickly. Part of what what have I done?
It's not showing now.
It's not showing.
Did it
Share my
disappear?
screen again. Okay, part of, is it showing now?
Yeah.
Okay, so part of what we've begun to find is that there is the Babylonian, Jewish Babylonian Aramaic incantation bowls from the 5th to the 7th century, all found in the ground, all found in the ground, buried there as part of these incantations meant to ward off demons and other malevolent forces. We used to think of them as popular practice, popular religion, and therefore reflecting the practice of non-rabbis, because of course the rabbis would never do magic. And slowly but surely we've come to realize that this is a false binary. Not only do the rabbis do magic, but also the bowls do rabbis. And part of what we do in this paper is we essentially collect all the data that we could get about rabbis' rabbinic teachings in the bowls, again, for this crucial Dark Age period. And we find things like, for instance, what we have here, a citation from the Mishnah. Actually, the earliest physical citation of the Mishnah are 3 incantation bowls. Here we have from Mishnah Shavuot, and then there are 2 from Mishnah Zvachim, chapters 5.3 and 5.4, Mishnah 5.3 and 5.4. But we have 3, therefore, citations from the Mishnah in the bowls invoked as magical, powerful utterances that you'd read this and you'd have power. We have the names of late rabbis who appear at the latest parts of the Talmud, and also they appear in the incantation bowls. So whoever these people are writing them, they're aware of these rabbis, and they imbue them with not just legal power, but also with legal and miraculous power. And lastly, and this is actually, I think, being shown for the first time, but it will be published, we found a bowl which has never before been published that actually mentions academy heads. And it doesn't seem to mean study circle heads or disciple circle heads, masters. It actually seems to refer here, it seems to institutional heads. We don't know when this dates to. Is it 6th century? Is it 7th century? It's hard to know, but this is undoubtedly the earliest physical evidence of this institution that we would have. And notice how you invoke the ban, this kind of excommunicational power of the academy heads and all the rabbis. And therefore we seem to have academy heads and then those beneath them. So that's just to give you a taste of how one might use the bowls to begin to fill out our picture of the Dark Ages. It won't do everything. It won't do everything I wish they could do, but it'll certainly help.
I think I'm going to try to squeeze in one last question with about two minutes remaining. There are several questions about asking about relations to non-Jewish modes or traditions aside from the early disciple context. So especially in the move towards codification and closure. So are there ways that you can think about either influence or overlap or connection with Islamic jurisprudence, with Christian contexts?
This is a very frustrating area and question. I, as a historian, I love Jews, but Jewish exceptionalism as a historical assumption is not one that I work with. That is, I work with the assumption that Jews in all periods are people of their time and place, and we need to understand them as such. And the Talmud does seem to be exceptional, which I don't want it to be. I would love it to be a normal text like every other text, but it's not. And therefore scholars have and continue to try to find some kind of literary or generic parallel for the Talmud that might explain it, the missing link that can unlock what's going on here. I don't find these always to be entirely persuasive. So people have looked at Zoroastrian law codes or commentaries. They don't work so well. There are some scholars, Noah Bickhart, I should name, and Paul Mandel at the center this semester, who just presented on this, who are arguing that perhaps we can begin to see on an internal level some process by which scholastic people start to redact or collect and compile, and we might find something similar among Syriac Christians, maybe. Some of this question depends on when you date the compilation of the Talmud. Is it 6th, 7th century? Is it 6th through 8th, 9th century? I tend to think it's earlier, but some people want to push it later, and then you'd have Islamic comparanda. But I would say this is kind of one of those enduring questions. I wish there was a compelling answer because I want one, but I mean, we maybe have to accept sometimes things are exceptional, and maybe the Talmud is exceptional, and that's a great place to end a talk about the Talmud.
That is a fantastic place to end. Thank you so much. And I want to thank again my colleagues here at the center. Thank you so much, Simcha. Thank you everyone for being here. I apologize if we weren't able to get to your questions. Really, they were so smart. So I hope that you'll all be able to attend again next week when we have Shai Sekunda from Bard College here on a second mission to talk about the Talmud from another perspective. I'm hopeful that everybody has enjoyed this as much as I have. Thank you so much.